The air was thick with anticipation as the crowd gathered in the Piazza della Signoria. It was a chilly morning, yet the square was packed. People murmured, their eyes fixed on the gallows that stood tall and ominous in the center. High above, the Signoria's palace loomed, its red banners fluttering in the breeze. This was the day they had been waiting for, the day of judgment. At the base of the gallows, a wooden platform was already set up. On it, 3 chains dangled, each one heavy and cold, waiting to do their grim work. The crowd was a mix of the curious, the vengeful, and the grieving. Some whispered prayers, others shouted curses. The tension was palpable, a storm of emotions ready to burst. Suddenly, the gates of the Palazzo della Signoria opened, and a group of guards emerged, dragging 3 men in their midst. The first was a tall, thin figure, his robes torn and dirty. His face was gaunt, his eyes filled with a mix of defiance and sorrow. This was Fra Girolamo Savonarola, the once powerful preacher who had held Florence in the palm of his hand. Beside him were 2 of his loyal followers, Fra Domenico and Fra Silvestro, their faces equally worn but determined. The crowd fell silent as the 3 men were forced onto the platform. Savonarola looked out at the sea of faces, his voice steady despite the obvious pain he was in. Brothers and sisters, this is not the end. This is the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of truth and justice. But there was no time for speeches. The guards moved quickly, fitting the chains around the necks of the 3 men. The crowd watched, some with tears in their eyes, others with grim satisfaction. The executioner, a tall man with a cold, emotionless face, gave the signal. The platform dropped, and the 3 men swung, their bodies jerking as the chains tightened around their necks. The crowd erupted into a chaotic mix of cheers and sobs. Some shouted, "Justice is served," while others cried, "God will avenge them." The scene was a tableau of raw human emotion, a testament to the power of Savonarola's words and the depth of the city's divide. As the bodies hung lifeless, the executioner's assistants began to prepare the fire. They stacked wood and kindling around the platform, pouring buckets of oil to ensure the flames would burn hot and fast. The crowd stepped back, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and the smell of death. The fire was lit, and the flames roared to life, engulfing the platform and the bodies. The heat was intense, and the crowd fell back further, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. The bodies of Savonarola and his followers twisted and blackened, the chains glowing red-hot in the inferno. The crowd watched in a mixture of awe and horror, the sound of the crackling fire mingling with the occasional cry from the onlookers. As the flames died down, the executioners used long poles to push the remaining bones and ashes into the Arno River. The water carried the remnants away, a final grim act of erasure. But for some, the memory of Savonarola's words would linger, a fire that could not be extinguished so easily. The city of Florence, once a beacon of art and culture, now stood at a crossroads. The fall of Savonarola marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, an era of uncertainty and change. But the spirit of the people, the spirit of a city that had known both greatness and darkness, would not be easily tamed. The story of Florence was far from over. Michelangelo's world was turned upside down when his close friend, the powerful Lorenzo de' Medici, appeared to him in a dream, dressed in rags and warning that his son, Piero, would be driven from their home in Florence, never to return. This dream was so vivid that Michelangelo, just 19 years old at the time, decided to flee Florence before Piero's exile. He was afraid that his strong ties to the Medici family would put him in danger. Michelangelo ended up in Rome, where he found work with a banker named Jacopo Galli. Galli commissioned Michelangelo to create a statue of Bacchus, the ancient Greek god of wine and revelry. Michelangelo's Bacchus was a striking figure with a merry face, squinting, lustful eyes, and a slightly off-balance stance, supported by a small satyr. This statue showed Michelangelo's skill in capturing the psychological depth of his subjects. Soon after, Michelangelo received a commission from the French Cardinal of Saint Denis to create a Pietà, a sculpture depicting the Virgin Mary holding the body of Christ after the crucifixion. Michelangelo's Pietà, completed in 1500 when he was only 25, was a masterpiece. The contrast between the smooth, naked body of Christ and the flowing drapes of Mary's dress was masterful. Mary's face was serene yet full of sorrow, while Christ's face still showed the agony of his death. The statue was so lifelike that it was hard to believe it was the work of such a young artist. However, not everyone was satisfied with the Pietà. People, including Michelangelo's biographer Ascanio Condivi, wondered why Mary looked so young compared to Christ. Michelangelo explained that chaste women stay fresher, but some believed his portrayal of Mary's youth was influenced by his own personal experiences, such as the early deaths of his mother and nurse. When Michelangelo returned to Florence in 1500, the city was in turmoil. The once proud city was struggling, and the streets were becoming dangerous. The government was weak, and the people were unhappy. Despite the chaos, the new gonfalonier, Piero Soderini, recognized Michelangelo's talent and commissioned him to create a statue that would restore Florence's pride. The wardens of Santa Maria del Fiore had a massive block of marble that had been abandoned by another sculptor. Soderini suggested to Michelangelo that he use this block to create a statue of David, the biblical hero who symbolized Florence's republican spirit. Michelangelo, despite the daunting task, accepted the commission. He worked tirelessly, often in the heat of summer and the cold of winter, living frugally and keeping his work secret. In just 18 months, Michelangelo completed his David. The statue was twice life-size, a remarkable physical feat, and an artistic triumph. David was a powerful yet graceful figure, embodying the human spirit and the ideal of human potential. The statue's expression was both defiant and contemplative, giving it a sense of both humanity and transcendence. Michelangelo's David became a symbol of Florence's resilience and strength. When the statue was finally ready, it was a challenge to move it. The cathedral workshop's wall had to be demolished to get the statue out. Then, using a wooden framework and ropes, the statue was carefully transported through the city streets, a process that took 4 days. The statue was eventually placed outside the Palazzo della Signoria, where it stood as a protector of the city. Soderini, who had a private viewing of the statue, suggested that the nose was too large. Michelangelo, annoyed but diplomatic, pretended to make adjustments while letting marble dust fall. Soderini was satisfied, and the statue was unveiled to the public. Some people criticized the statue's size and the fact that it could have been mistaken for other ancient heroes, but most were in awe of Michelangelo's skill. The statue's hands and facial features were slightly exaggerated to make it appear larger when viewed from below. After completing David, Michelangelo faced a new challenge. In 1504, he was commissioned to paint a battle scene in the Palazzo della Signoria, next to a mural being painted by his rival, Leonardo da Vinci. This competition was a test of their skills, and a way to celebrate Florence's military victories. Michelangelo studied Leonardo's work and learned from him, but the competition ended before either artist could finish. Michelangelo was called to Rome by Pope Julius II, who wanted him to create a grand tomb for the Pope, a project that would involve 40 large sculptures. Michelangelo's journey from a young sculptor fleeing Florence to a renowned artist creating masterpieces in Rome was just beginning. His work would continue to inspire and challenge the world, leaving an indelible mark on the history of art. When Michelangelo returned to Rome in 1505, the city had transformed dramatically. It had taken over from Florence as the heart of the Renaissance, a change that was partly due to Florence's decline after the death of Lorenzo de' Medici in 1492. Just 100 years before, Rome was a small medieval town with narrow, dirty streets and ancient ruins that most people didn't understand. The Claudia Aqueduct, with its towering arches, was thought to have been used for bringing olive oil from Naples. Wolves roamed the streets at night, and the old aristocratic families and cardinals lived in fortified palaces, hiding behind their walls. Despite the squalor, the city attracted bankers like Giovanni di Bixi and Cosimo de' Medici, who learned their trade in Rome around 1400. For much of the 14th century, the popes didn't even live in Rome, preferring cities like Avignon. It wasn't until the Council of Constance, 1414-18, that the situation was resolved, and Pope Martin V returned to Rome in 1420. He set up his residence in the Castel Sant'Angelo, an ancient fortress built by Emperor Hadrian. Gradually, the popes brought order to the city, but it was a rough process. Executed criminals were often hung from the castle walls, making the bridge across the Tiber nearly impossible to cross because of the stench. Powerful cardinals started building grand palaces, using stones from ancient ruins. The city's 7 hills, once the heart of ancient Rome, were now covered in vineyards and gardens, and the forum was used for grazing cattle. Despite this, Rome relied on pilgrims and tourists for its economy, and the city was full of thieves, fake relic dealers, and ragged monks. By the late 15th century, Rome had become a vibrant center of culture. The completion of Cardinal Raffaele Rario's magnificent palazzo in 1498 marked the city's rise over Florence. The population had doubled to 50,000, equaling that of Florence. However, beneath the surface, Rome was still a dangerous place. There were 7,000 prostitutes and a similar number of criminals. The murder rate was high, and while many were caught, only the poorest ended up hanging from the castle walls. Pope Alexander VI famously said, "Our Lord is not so much interested in the death of sinners, more that they are able to pay for their sins and continue living." Into this chaotic and exciting city came the young Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni, known for his intelligence and laziness, had been groomed for a career in the church from a young age. His father, Lorenzo, had secured him a cardinal's position at the age of 13, a move that was unprecedented. Lorenzo's strategy was to ensure the Medici family's survival, even if they were forced into exile. Instead of relying on their bank, which was failing, the Medici aimed to infiltrate the church for greater power and wealth. Lorenzo had cultivated a friendship with Pope Innocent VIII, sending him barrels of Tuscan wine and arranging marriages to solidify alliances. In 1489, Innocent VIII finally made Giovanni a cardinal, but the appointment was kept secret until Giovanni turned 16. Lorenzo, on his deathbed, wrote a letter to Giovanni, urging him to rise early and behave with dignity. Giovanni, now 16, traveled to Rome to take up his new role. However, the political landscape was volatile. Pope Alexander VI, a member of the Borgia family, succeeded Innocent VIII, and Giovanni, now a cardinal, remarked, "We are in the clutches of a wolf." When Charles VIII invaded Italy, Giovanni and his brother Piero were exiled from Florence. Giovanni, recognizing the danger, decided to travel across Europe. He visited his cousin Giulio, also destined for the church, in Pisa, and then traveled with him to Venice and beyond. They spent 5 years traveling, making important connections and friends, including the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, a powerful and rough character who became a mentor to Giovanni. Giovanni returned to Rome in 1495, during the conflict between Pope Alexander VI and the fiery preacher Girolamo Savonarola. Giovanni, now a respected figure, hosted artists, humanists, and church dignitaries, and worked to support the Medici cause. When Alexander VI died in 1503, Giovanni participated in the conclave to elect the next pope, Pius III. When Pius III died shortly after, Giovanni supported Cardinal della Rovere, who became Pope Julius II. Julius II saw Giovanni as a protege, and his growing influence in Rome was closely watched by Florence, where many wondered what the Medici were planning next. Under the rule of Piero Soderini, Florence was slowly getting used to its new republican style of government. But this change was more about the way things looked rather than the actual structure. The Gonfaloniere, or chief magistrate, was now elected for life, but the rest of the government remained much the same. The Signoria and other committees were still chosen in the same way, and the members were still from the same families that had always held power, about 3,000 people in total. The big difference was that the elections were no longer controlled by powerful families like the Medici. Instead, the leading families were more evenly matched and just tried to outdo each other. Soderini, who was now a permanent figure as the Gonfaloniere, wasn't the most skilled politician, but he was smart enough to choose good advisors. One of his most talented advisors was a young man named Niccolò Machiavelli. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in 1469 during the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent, a powerful and influential leader. Machiavelli's father was a lawyer from an old Florentine family that had been wealthy and respected in the past, but by Machiavelli's time, they were not so well off. Machiavelli's mother died when he was young, but she had a big influence on him. She was well read and wrote poetry, which likely inspired her son's love of literature. Machiavelli's education was different from that of his wealthier peers. He learned Latin and studied the medieval ideas that were still common in his time. Later, his friends introduced him to the works of Roman poets, historians, and philosophers. These authors, like the Roman historian Tacitus and the poet Lucretius, helped Machiavelli understand the greatness of ancient Rome and the contrast with the divided and weak Italy of his time. Italy was going through a cultural transformation, and people were starting to notice. The word Rinascimento, Renaissance, was being used to describe this new age. The spread of printing meant that even someone like Machiavelli, who wasn't very rich, could buy books by his favorite authors. He was particularly interested in Tacitus, who wrote about cruel Roman emperors, and Lucretius, whose poem On the Nature of Things discussed the origins of the world and the harsh realities of human life. Machiavelli's early life was marked by political turmoil. He was 9 when the Pazzi conspiracy shook Florence, and by the time he was 25, he had seen the rise and fall of Savonarola, the banishment of Piero de' Medici, and the invasion of Florence by the French king Charles VIII. Despite the chaos, Machiavelli's sharp mind and wit made him stand out. In 1498, just after Savonarola's execution, Machiavelli was elected as the secretary to the Second Chancery. He was 29 years old and described as slender, with black eyes, black hair, and a small head. People noticed his keen observation skills and sarcastic expressions, but he was well liked by his intellectual friends and favored by Sodrini. His job involved managing the Florentine territories outside the city, and later, he became secretary to the Council of War, handling foreign relations for the Republic. Machiavelli's role required him to travel on diplomatic missions to places like France and Germany. He met important figures such as King Louis XII of France, Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and Pope Julius II. Despite the seriousness of his work, Machiavelli often wrote humorous letters to his friends about his adventures, including some embarrassing romantic escapades. He got married in 1501 and had 4 children, but he continued to travel and write to his friends about his misadventures. Machiavelli's character was complex. He admired great leaders and tried to learn from them, but he also had a side that enjoyed making jokes and appearing ridiculous to his friends. His admiration for leaders was not blind. He saw their flaws and learned from them. Machiavelli's humanism was practical and based on real-world experience, not idealistic or religious principles. He believed that to succeed in the world, one had to understand and deal with the full range of human behavior, including its darker aspects. Machiavelli's views became more hardened as he experienced the constant deceptions and tricks in the diplomatic world. He believed that to make Italy great again, it needed a leader who was willing to be ruthless and take extreme measures. One person who seemed to embody these qualities was Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI. Cesare Borgia was born in 1475 and was the illegitimate son of the man who would become Pope Alexander VI. Despite being Italian, Cesare was raised in a Spanish culture. He was charming, intelligent, and handsome, but he inherited his father's ruthless and amoral nature. Alexander VI had planned for Cesare to have a career in the church, but Cesare was more interested in military leadership. After poisoning his older brother, Cesare became the military commander of the papal forces. With the support of the French, he launched a military campaign in the Romagna region of Italy. By 1502, Cesare Borgia had conquered large parts of central Italy and was recognized as the Duke of the Romagna. When he threatened the borders of the Florentine Republic, Machiavelli was sent on a diplomatic mission to understand Borgia's intentions. The meeting was dramatic, taking place at night in the Grand Ducal Palace. Borgia alternated between flattering the Florentine delegation and threatening them. He said he respected Florence's neutrality, but warned that if they didn't become his allies, he would invade and restore the Medici to power. The Florentine delegates stood their ground, reminding Borgia of their alliance with France. Borgia laughed and dismissed their concerns, but Machiavelli saw through the bluff and reported back to Florence that Borgia was unlikely to attack, but his unpredictable nature made the situation dangerous. Borgia's next move was even more dramatic. His commander, Vitellozzo Vitelli, and several other officers rebelled, leaving Borgia vulnerable. Borgia used papal funds to hire French troops. and then agreed to meet the rebels to resolve the conflict. At the meeting in Senigallia, Borgia welcomed the rebels with a friendly face, but as soon as he had them separated from their troops, he had them arrested and strangled. This event deeply impressed Machiavelli and became a key example in his later works, particularly The Prince, where he described the necessity of being ruthless in politics. Machiavelli's experiences with Cesare Borgia and other powerful leaders shaped his political philosophy. He believed that to achieve and maintain power, a leader must be willing to do whatever it takes, even if it means being cruel or deceitful. His ideas about realpolitik, or the practical and often harsh realities of politics, would become his lasting legacy. As Machiavelli sat in his smallholding, surrounded by the rolling hills of Tuscany, he couldn't help but reflect on the tumultuous events that had led him there. His life, once filled with the intrigue and excitement of political power, was now reduced to tending to olive trees and vineyards, and passing the evenings in the local inn with the baker and the miller. Yet, even in this quiet exile, his mind remained active, his thoughts swirling with the lessons of his past and the possibilities of the future. Machiavelli had seen the best and worst of human nature. He had witnessed the cunning and ruthlessness of Cesare Borgia, the visionary genius of Leonardo da Vinci, and the cunning of Pope Julius II. Each of these men, in their own way, had taught him about the complex art of politics and the science of power. But it was his own experiences, his rise to prominence in Florence, his fall from grace, and his brutal torture that had shaped his most profound insights. In his time as a diplomat and military strategist, Machiavelli had learned that successful politics was not a matter of moral righteousness, but of practical action. The world, he believed, was a place where leaders had to be both bold and adaptable, where the ends often justified the means. This was the science of politics, a new and revolutionary idea that he would later articulate in his masterpiece, The Prince. When Machiavelli was finally released from the Bargello, his body ached from the torture and his spirit was bruised, but he refused to let his suffering break him. Instead, he used his experiences to fuel his writing. He poured his thoughts and observations into The Prince, a book that would challenge the conventional wisdom of his time and influence generations to come. In The Prince, Machiavelli laid out his vision of effective leadership. He argued that a ruler must be strong and decisive, willing to take risks and make tough decisions. He must be able to inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure, for without the fear of punishment, laws and moral sanctions would be meaningless. Machiavelli's words were not a call to tyranny, but a pragmatic guide for those who sought to govern in a world where power was often the only currency that mattered. Despite the simplicity of his new life, Machiavelli's mind was never at rest. He continued to write, exploring the nature of power and the complexities of human behavior. His other works, such as the Discourses on Livy, delved deeper into the principles of republican government and the importance of civic virtue. Even as he dreamed of returning to politics, Machiavelli found solace in the beauty of the Tuscan countryside. The hills, the vineyards, and the olive groves became a backdrop for his reflections, a place where he could distill his experiences into timeless wisdom. Years passed, and Machiavelli's reputation began to grow. His ideas, once seen as radical and even dangerous, started to be discussed and debated by scholars and statesmen. Though he never returned to the political stage, his influence lived on. His writings would go on to shape the thinking of political leaders and philosophers for centuries, proving that his insights were as relevant in his time as they are today. In the end, Machiavelli's legacy was not the power he once held, or the positions he lost. It was the enduring wisdom he left behind, a testament to his belief that understanding the science of politics was the key to navigating the complex and often unforgiving world of human affairs. Despite the challenges and setbacks, Machiavelli's spirit remained unbroken, a beacon of resilience and intellectual courage that continues to inspire those who seek to understand the art of governance.